Hello, everyone. Welcome to We Give Summit. Thank you so much for joining today. This session is Go Beyond Good Intentions, Engaging in Ethical Volunteering. My name is Melissa Vargas. I'm a program manager at Philanthropy Together. Together is a global initiative to grow and strengthen the field of collective giving with programming like We Give Summit. Today, we're super excited to hear from a panel of incredible leaders on how to volunteer ethically, intentionally, and with cultural awareness in order to create greater and more deep impact. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping reminders. Closed captioning is available and it can be enabled at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Be sure to stay on until the end of the session because we'll be raffling off a book from this year's speakers to one of our attendees today. So make sure to stay through till the end. Engage with us in the chat and be mindful of our We Give Summit community guidelines, which I'll drop in the chat in a moment. And then at the end of the session, be sure to answer our quick 2-question poll. It helps us get a better sense of how you're taking in the sessions. So with that being said, I'm happy to introduce today's moderator, Danielle Holly with Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who's going to kick us off.
All right, there's my video. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session. I am so excited to be here with you today. I'm Danielle Holly. I am the lead of North America for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and spent also 15 years in the volunteering and giving space, leading an organization called Common Impact. And I hope you all have enjoyed the conference. For those of you who have been to sessions before this, and excited to have you here and kind of powering through the afternoon. I'll do a brief introduction of our panelists, and then we'll pass it quickly to them to share a little bit more about their work and our conversation and our prep call. I think we're just of Melissa's overview, we're really ready to have a meaningful discussion around how to engage in your community in an ethical and in a way that really meets intent with action. We have Dena Trujillo from the Crisis Text Line, Alonda Williams from Big Brothers Big Sister of Puget Sound, and then Jude O'Reilly of Volunteer Match. And before we move into our panel and our discussion, really want to understand who's in the room. So we have a poll to help us understand that, and would love to hear whether you're a longtime volunteer, a longtime donor, a Giving Circle member, and kind of what position you come in. You can see some of the options here so that we can target our conversation to your interests and your background. We'll give it another minute to have people vote in. And I think whenever we're ready, we can show the results and keep going. All right, we have veterans in the room. We've got longtime volunteers, folks that are part of Giving Circles already or another collective giving group. We have a couple of folks, it seems like, who are interested in starting or participating in a Giving Circle, but haven't yet. So that's great to know. And I think a great moment to be in this conversation as you get started with your thinking and shaping about your participation in a Giving Circle. The other thing that I'll ask of our guests before we get started is what you'd like to learn today. What's the one question that you have or the one big topic that you want to make sure we touch upon today? And you can just throw that in the chat when you're ready, and we'll see that come in, and we'll be sure to incorporate it as we go. So feel free to enter that now or as the conversation progresses in order to make sure your voice is heard. We have a limited amount of time today, so I want to make sure that we're getting to your questions. Okay, and with that, why don't we begin? We'll pass it to our panelists who are coming on video as we speak. And Alonda, I'm going to pick on you because you came on video first. Would love for you to share a little bit about your background, the work your organization does, and how it touches ethical volunteering.
Sure. So I am Alonda Williams, President and CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Puget Sound. And we can't do our work without volunteers. And so all of our work, everything that we do, we match young people with volunteers that are caring adults involved in a young person's life. And we are the largest in the state and the oldest mentoring organization, but really volunteer run. So this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart and something that we talk about all the time. So I'm happy to be here, happy to interact with all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alonda. Jude, how about you?
Danielle, thanks so much for having me. My name is Jude O'Reilly. Until recently, I was the CEO of an organization called Volunteer Match. Volunteer Match is as simple as the name implies. It connects volunteers and nonprofits throughout the US. Prior to that, I was responsible for something called the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship at the Skoll Foundation.
Fabulous. Dena, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Lovely to meet you. So virtually, I am CEO of Crisis Text Line. You can think of us as a 24/7 mental health emergency room. By texting in 741-741, anybody, anytime can be connected to another caring individual who are volunteers. So when I say mental health emergency room, I mean it. Anything from anxiety, eating disorders, bullying, suicide, any of those issues. And we support last year, we supported 1.3 million conversations in the US, and 15,000 volunteers made that possible. They worked with almost 100 of our clinical supervisors to make sure that every single person was able to get the support that they needed. So volunteers are near and dear to my heart. And again, we couldn't do this service without them. Oh, I should have said, I forgot. Before that, for 17 years, I was in philanthropy. I was right down the road from Jude, working at Omidyar Network from the founder of eBay. So I'm very lucky to have spent so much time on the giving side and now get to help be on the front lines, enabling the giving of volunteers and helping people in their moments of need.
Well, it's so important, right, to be able to have seen both sides, to develop empathy across the lines. And Dena, why don't we stick with you for a moment? Because what I'd love to do at the top of this conversation is just define ethical volunteering. Those are two very big terms, right? And brought together, I think, mean a lot of different things to different people and show up in different ways. So would love to, and for all the panelists, we'll get your perspective. But Dena, how would you define ethical volunteering? How does it show up in your work right now?
Yeah, I mean, all of our definitions, I think, are going to complement each other. And for us, really, I think it means being aware that you're there for the person that you're connecting with, not for yourself, and to be conscious of saviorism. So you can imagine in a crisis line, people sometimes it can be easy to kind of want to save the other person. But as a volunteer, really, you have to believe that you and the person texting in have the strength and the power to help themselves and help each other. And it's that common regard and respect for who you're working with. I think that's really, really important.
Excellent. And Alonda, that reminds me of a conversation, a story that you shared in our prep call that hit at that same question and issue. How would you define ethical volunteering, and how does it show up in your work?
Yeah, I agree with what Dena said, and I would add that I also think it is about doing no harm. And I think we're here to give of ourselves, and I'm a person who believes that when I leave this earth, I want to be completely used up. And so I think about volunteering as a greatest gift that you can give to someone, but to do that in a manner that does not cause harm. And so when I think about ethical volunteering, that's really what I think about. And the story that I shared with you really is very similar to sort of Dena's idea of saviorism. But from my perspective, given that we're dealing with young people, a lot of times people kind of enter into volunteering with the picture in their head of what they think it's going to be, or the way that they think they should show up. And it might be very different. And so I think ethical volunteering is about trusting the organization too, that you're partnered with, to make sure, just to understand that they're putting you where they believe you would be of best service.
Excellent. Thank you, Alonda.
Mhm.
Jude, how would you respond to that same prompt?
Wow, I love what's been said so far. I would say ethical volunteering recognizes the self in the service, and realizes that you've been invited into a conversation. You know, by being invited to volunteer, you're being asked to participate in a conversation in a community, as opposed to come in and ready to make a speech. Which is to say, you're there to listen, to understand, to deepen your sense of community and commitment. And that's I think a great way to begin an ethical volunteering relationship.
Oh, yeah.
And how do we,
Can I just say, like, I just love what both of you have said, because it makes me think of another piece around this non-judgmental. You don't know where other people are coming from. So you really do have to trust the organization and trust the process to be able to meet people where they are.
and it gets to some of what I'm seeing a lot in the chat in terms of the questions folks have is when you volunteer, often you are bringing yourself into a new and different community in some way, shape, or form. And given the cultural differences that exist in this country, how do we set up volunteer engagement so that we are supporting the bridging of those differences? And as you just articulated, right, the understanding that you don't always understand where people are coming from and what needs are. Would be curious for anyone to respond to that. What are your thoughts?
I'll just say that there is a term that I somewhat bristle when I hear it, and it's very common, and that is, people often say they want to give back, right? And when you give back, it sort of implies that you're in one place and you're giving back to someone who's in a different place than you are. And I think that sets you up for this potential for saviorism, or this potential for, like, I am using my resources to help, my time to help someone who is behind me, or, there's something about that term of giving back. So I just have people think about giving, period. Like, you're just giving of yourself, giving of your time. And I think when you engage in that from that perspective, it helps you to enter it into sort of, like, we might be very different, but that doesn't mean that there's an inequality. Like, I have a little sister who is 13. I learned just as much from her as she probably learned. I probably learned more from her than she learns from me. So, there's an age difference, but I learned too, and I approach it in that manner. So anyway.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Is that volunteering and giving is not all motivated by what you perceive as the needs of the community. It's also driven by what you need yourself, whether that's kind of your own skill and experience development, or self-worth and feelings of altruism. The list is long. And Dena, I know that Crisis Text Line has done a lot on data gathering and research on the benefit to the volunteer, and would just love to hear you talk about this, Jude. I know you have thoughts on this too, because I think it's a bit of a taboo subject to talk about what you get out of these engagements as you move forward with them, but I think it's a really important part of the dynamic and balancing.
Jude, do you want to go first? I say that because you've got some great stats on overall volunteering, and then I can give the Crisis Text Line direct.
Oh, happy to, Dena. That's very generous of you. I think we're in the midst of a shift. At least I hope, and I see some early signs that people are seeing, it's to a certain extent generational, a difference in the reason they show up. That once upon a time, generations used words like altruism and benevolence, words that kind of implied there was something broken over there and I need to come fix it, to ones that emphasize connection and that acknowledge increasingly, and I'm speaking largely about the United States, and I realize we have an international audience, and this dynamic may or may not be similar in places in the world where you're doing your work today, but sometimes in the United States, the conversation is very much increasingly focused on, well, there's something that I need. Like I need that sense of connection. We are in the midst of an epidemic of isolation and loneliness here in the US. The federal government put very strong data together last year. 18 to 23-year-olds over the last 13 years have never been more isolated generationally. The group of people that you actually expect to be most socially connected are actually have had the greatest decline in social connection over the last 13 years. And that's extraordinary. One of the ways you measure that is the time that you spend with friends. And that time spent in person with friends has declined as much as 70%, 70 in the last 13 years. And we probably all have reasons in our head why that might be true. But there is an easy solution at hand. And that solution is beginning that conversation with community. And the broader data in volunteering is telling us that while COVID in the US punched a giant hole in volunteering for lots of obvious reasons, many of us appropriately were being told to stay home for health reasons during that time, and much volunteering takes place in person. We're happy to say at Volunteer Match that the data that we see is saying that volunteers are beginning to come back. And one of the reasons they're coming back is, we believe, is that desire for connection, that desire to be in communion with our community, with our friends and family more now than ever before. And Dena's done some remarkable work studying that over at Crisis Text Line.
Well, and that's, we've been around for 10 years and been doing this for 10 years and have trained over 65,000 volunteers. And we had a lot of anecdotal stories around people using the skills that they learn with us, because volunteers have to get about 30 hours of training, and then they commit hours to being in direct conversation with folks, and they get regular updates. So we really looked at it and said, what is happening long term? Because we were trying to study other impacts, and we weren't studying the impact on our volunteers, even though we were hearing they were better parents, or they were de-escalating strangers at grocery stores in their community. So all of that research that Jude just talked about, we were wondering if it was the same for Crisis Text Line or different, because we're 100% remote. You don't get that in-person volunteering element, and we're dealing with really hard things sometimes, right? You're dealing with suicide and abuse, and sometimes, and so are those positive impacts from volunteering overall really going to be present? And what we found was that they blew us away. So 2/3 of our volunteers say that their own mental health is improved as a result, because of the training that they receive and because of the practice that they receive, and that sense of purpose and connection, exactly what Jude was talking about. The element that's really impacting our strategy right now, in addition to that, is that 90% of our volunteers say that they're taking those skills, de-escalation, active listening, empathy, those skills that help us connect with each other as humans in person or online. They're taking those skills back home with them to their families, to their schools, to their workplaces and communities. And so now we're looking around at this world where we're in a loneliness crisis. We're in a loneliness epidemic while also being in a mental health epidemic. It's not really possible to hire enough mental health workers fast enough. So what do we do as a community? And so we're trying to look at this and say, okay, we can build the skills by increasing volunteering. Imagine like if we can have more and more volunteers that can have these skills back in their communities, what does that look like when we're preventing the crisis? Because we know how to talk to each other, and we know how to listen. And we know how to actually not be lonely, because we can connect both with families and new people in our communities. And we think that that's going to extend even further into not just Crisis Text Line.
And I think that
Right.
gets back to go ahead, Alonda.
No,
please.
go for it.
I was just going to connect that to some of the research that Jude shared, which is that COVID really shifted the dynamic of volunteerism, not necessarily the intent, but the ability to volunteer, and feeds, of course, along with social media and so many other societal dynamics feeds this loneliness crisis. And I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat around how we can re-engage post-COVID, and we're now, significantly out of the heart of the crisis, and there's a lot that's residual in our society. So curious in terms of both getting and building excitement for volunteering and giving, but also creating those connections and that the kind of balance dynamic and empathy that we've all been talking about. What does that look like in a post-COVID world?
I could share a little bit. I was just having this conversation yesterday with one of our corporate partners. We engage through Big Brothers Big Sisters across the country, and certainly in our area, we engage with a lot of companies for site-based and schools for site-based volunteering, where we bring young people to a workplace, or we have employees come into a school. That was hardest hit by COVID for us, getting back onto campuses, whether it's an elementary school or a workplace. And what we've learned is that we need to have many flavors of volunteering. So we need to make sure that we're creating micro volunteering opportunities, macro volunteering opportunities, the traditional ones that we would typically do, but also every possible flavor, because the on-ramp to volunteering for some people may be very different than it was before. And so that's sort of element number one, is have a lot of variety to the ways that people can engage. And then the other is making sure that there's a WIFM. People, even though there is certainly a giving component, I agree with the panelists earlier's comments about, people want to know what's in it for me. And I don't mean that in an inappropriate way. I mean that they need to understand that there are benefits to this for you too. Like, you are going to learn. And I think about how amazing is it that when people, like, my goal is, if somebody interacts with our organization, when they're done, they are now a more compassionate, empathetic member of society, right? And not that you can tell them that, but you can definitely tell them that, there's something you're going to learn from this as well. And you'll find that it'll help you in your own daily kind of life too. You'll just find that you have a friend, or you have a new experience. So anyway.
Thank
And
you.
being more comfortable as a society, describing exactly what Alonda just spoke to, that idea that I can be part of a conversation that's beneficial for the nonprofit that I'm being in service of, and the community that nonprofit serves. And I also can learn job skills that might be vital to me in my next role. The federal government study says your chances of getting a job as an unemployed person volunteering increase about 30%. And so, like, many people volunteer in areas that are maybe of professional interest to them. They're thinking about working in healthcare, but today they work in a different field, and so they volunteer in a hospital, and they get a sense for what that climate might be like. And being more and more as a community comfortable saying, certainly, what I needs to be, first of all, as was said before, it needs to avoid harm. Second, I hope to actually do some good, and it's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a great thing. If I can pull some of that, if I can bring some of that experience, along with me, in the rest of my life.
And I think an important part of that is defining what a skill and a capability is. At Common Impact, we were leading skills-based volunteering efforts. And one of the things that was so important to communicating to volunteers is that your skills are not just the things that you might see on LinkedIn as checkboxes, right? It's not just copywriting and marketing and operations and finance. There are, as we were talking about before, de-escalation and an ability to create conversation and create openness. And there's a ton of life skills that we all use every day and are our quote unquote superpowers that we can also tap into when we're volunteering. And sometimes are much more powerful than the things that we do when we open up our laptops or head to our jobs every day.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you know, one of the things that's interesting for us is because so many of our volunteers are young. So you have to be 18 to volunteer with us, but 55% of our volunteers are between 18 and 24. And so we have a lot of people moving into the mental health space, like they volunteer and then discover they want to work in mental health or some kind of caregiving as part of their jobs. But also, this is a generation that grew up on their phones. So we're literally reteaching them how to listen and how to ask questions and how to connect and engage to that point of like, what are the other skills that you learn? There's so many, and I will say one of the things you were talking about earlier and one of the questions, which also gets to a little bit of just how do you meet people that are of diverse backgrounds. And so the listening and the asking questions, we can talk more about that. But I think the skills that you learn really to do so well and ethically require the listening and being present.
Right. And assuming that your experience is not necessarily the experience or a dominant experience. I'm looking at one of the questions from Kanoa. I think it's such an important point, which is this idea of the trauma that can be raised in volunteering in a giving situation for the individual who's volunteering or giving, that it can activate their own trauma. How do you, as a volunteer or donor or the group that is organizing an event like that, prepare individuals for what they might experience in unexpected ways as they head into those engagements?
I'm sure Dena, you should go first because
I was gonna say.
I can certainly speak to it for sure, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this is like foundational. So one, we have a lot of trigger warnings throughout our entire process, right? So at the beginning, like if you're being a volunteer for us can both be healing and triggering. And we're not going to presume which that is for you. So we're going to give the opening and the clarity, but then you at volunteer get to decide. So if you've experienced abuse, right, like we're not going to say you can't do it. We're going to let you know that that may be something both that's a part of training or a part of supporting people that are in traumatic situations. But then we do a lot of our training is on listening, right? And is on empathy. And then, so one is letting people know, being transparent about that. Two is on our platform, we have supervisors, trained professionals, and we have volunteers at differing levels of experience. And we have the platform structured for peer support. And we also have it structured so that people can tap out if they're being triggered, meaning we only do text and chat. So if you're on a phone call, you can't get off that phone call with somebody that you're supporting because that would be traumatizing to the person calling in for help. If you're in a text situation and you're dealing with an abuse situation that you unexpectedly find yourself triggered with, then we have the systems put in place such that you can let your supervisor know and you can hand that off to somebody and there's a record. The texter has no idea. Another compassionate, ready person is there to hold space for them. And then we've got supervisors to hold space for the volunteers. And then we have an entire separate volunteer community platform that people can go to when they're done to be able to process and to be able to support each other because we're dealing with really intense subjects. And then sometimes people will come back and say, I'm not ready to take more conversations, but can I coach other people? Or are there other things I can do to volunteer until they feel ready to come back?
That's beautiful. I love that you have that structure set up. We put in place a structure because we found that, a couple of years ago, staff were being just triggered and had a lot of secondary trauma. And so we have a therapist that's available on call several times a week for staff. We hold healing sessions. We make sure that our staff take breaks and take rest days if they need to take, we have extra support days just in case they need to take the time off because Sometimes it can compound, and sometimes the young people that we're working with have some adverse childhood experiences, and it could be very triggering, and it could just be a lot. So we try to make sure that we support our staff with both professional support with the therapist, as well as community support, and then also just time away. It's really, really important for us. And so it's been a very deliberate investment so that
Yeah.
we can make sure we support and not only our staff, but also our bigs. Like our bigs in many cases are being exposed. Some of them are being exposed to situations that either they have not been exposed to. And so we make sure we have training for them. And similarly, the therapist can be available for them as well.
I love that, Alonda. I love that. We have stipends for therapy and for wellness as well, so that staff can tap into that when they don't want to have their peer support groups. Yeah.
I think these are great examples of what extraordinary nonprofits do to create the conditions for that conversation, and not just with their own staff, but also with volunteers as well. They help create the context that makes a great conversation possible. I remember really early in my career, I worked in a predominantly Black neighborhood in North Philadelphia. I was new to that community. I was sat down on day one by the kind of volunteer coordinator, the person who ran that program. He said, "Listen, you're making people in this community do work. Every time you leave this space and you walk around this community, old folk in this community are looking out for you. They're thinking about you," which is to say they're doing work and they're not getting paid for it. So what we're doing in the community, the volunteering that we were doing, is a small way of making up for that work that they are doing. I worked with a community in Dallas, and before they told me where the bathrooms were, or where the emergency exits were, the standard stuff that volunteer programs did, they told me why this program exists here, why they were providing social services in this community, minutes away from the heart of robust downtown Dallas. And they said it's because they put this interstate here. This interstate made this program necessary because it cut these people from this community off from the jobs that existed downtown. He walked me through 30 minutes of thoughtful 100 years of history about this community that gave me the context for understanding the resilience, the strength, the ability that existed in that program. And those are things that's the kind of context that great nonprofits provide to the people of certain people that are looking to, quote unquote, be of service in their programs.
Well, I'm glad you didn't have to go to the bathroom initially.
I found it. It all worked out.
I wanted to share, there are a couple of questions coming in, and thank you for this audience for being so engaged. You're giving us our run of show here. This is reinforcing that this is a really important and a very big topic. There's a question around volunteer tourism, and then I think relatedly, to some extent, volunteers kind of imposing their own values and perspectives on the folks that they are engaged with in these volunteer activities. And so, I think that is an extension of the conversation we were having before, where yes, it's important for volunteers to get something out of it, or to recognize that they're getting something out of the engagement, but the intentions or the unintended intentions aren't always particularly productive or healthy. So curious if folks have perspective on volunteer tourism in general and kind of that values alignment. And maybe Alonda, I'll start with you and then we can pass it around.
Sure. As you can imagine, this is something that we deal with every day in a variety of ways. And so what Big Brothers Big Sisters does really, really well is we make great matches, but it takes a lot of time. And sometimes we have to say no to people who may not be ready or may not be in the right headspace. And that is okay. So our way of trying to understand where the person is coming from, and if there are any of those beliefs, and I'll just be honest with you, there are lots of situations, whether it has to do with cultural or any, beliefs about a particular ethnicity, religious beliefs, LGBTQ issues. We ask a lot of questions, we create a lot of scenarios, and our staff can sort of find that out from an interview. We do a 2-hour interview. And then additionally, there's additional conversations because we want to make sure that, you know, we are always thinking about the most marginalized in our community. So if there is a Black trans woman or young lady who decides to come out to their big or decides to become trans in the process, or they're struggling with their identity, we have to make sure that every single one of our volunteers is ready for that situation. Or if they are not, and they have a different preference, we're really clear on what would be okay for them and what would be okay for that young person. We center the young person. We try to center the most marginalized so that we are making sure that any situation that person is trained and ready for. And when we find that it doesn't happen, we will say no and direct them to another amazing organization. You know, everything isn't for everybody. So we have to take really hard lines about that kind of that sort of disclosure, because it is important to make sure that there's no harm. We can't, that's our goal, is to never cause harm with the young person. So it's important to us to try to find out that in conversations. And you'd be surprised at what people will say. I mean, you stay on the phone long enough or have in their interview long enough, lots of things will come out. And so our staff is really great at getting to that.
You know where you're going now?
Okay, I'll go, Jude. I will be honest that I don't have a whole lot of experience around international, especially like tourism, volunteer tourism. But I would only say that I wouldn't pick some place unless they had the similar volumes of values and like stories that Jude was talking about, right? You have to have respect for the place that you're going. From a making sure that we have a space that's safe, very similar to Alonda, our number one priority is the safety of our texters. And so there's a screening process first with our volunteers, similarly, like, so you can imagine you have to be able to hold space for anything. So you yourself may be everything from being pro-life, you yourself may be conservative, Republican, pro-life, but can you hold space for a young girl that needs to be able to talk about her choice without giving advice? You don't, because that's the thing. And that's one of the keys into creating a space that is safe and non-judgmental and allows for people of different cultures to connect is at least in crisis response, you cannot be giving advice. It is about questions, and it is about meeting them where they are and getting them the resources that they need. And so we have a screening process, and then we have oversight because we're text and because we have volunteers overseeing, I mean, our paid supervisors, our professional clinicians overseeing every conversation. If somebody ends up placing their religious or personal or values-based beliefs on top of a texter, that is found and removed immediately. And then those volunteers are given feedback, given a chance, possibly depending on how significant it was, to learn, because we always want people to learn. And then if they can learn, then they can stay. And if they can't, then they need to go. But one of the things that that you wouldn't necessarily expect, we get asked a lot if people should be matched, right? Should the volunteer and the texter be matched? And one of our questions is always, well, based on which demographic and which trauma do you want to have them matched for the moment? And so instead, but yet we do this research and we've found that actually there's no difference in quality of experience or satisfaction of experience, no matter what demographic pairing we get. And we have done that research over 10 years. We've had third-party people do the research, and it is incredibly consistent. And I believe that that is because it is about listening and asking questions and respecting and connecting, and that we're actually building skills. Alonda, like your example, one of the volunteers that I met years ago was a white woman in rural Montana, conservative. She had never met an LGBTQ youth of color. And yet she was able to connect with and support, Black LGBTQ youth in Miami or all over the country. And that actually was creating more connection, right? Like she's not sharing any of her perspectives because the conversation is about the person that she's helping. But that connection of people coming from very different backgrounds, still finding that common support is, I think, what can be beautiful if you create the right circumstances for people to connect.
I would say we've seen the same exact research, believe it or not, in that there is no correlation between ethnicity, age, between a successful or a long-standing match and one that is not. It's not correlated by age or ethnicity. It is, however, by interest, by dislikes. Someone intensely hates football, finding someone else that intensely hates football is actually a stronger match than finding someone that loves football but that might be identical to you, and
Right.
you hate football. So that's just an example, but my point is interests are really, really important. And so we have found that and it is beautiful. It really, you come together around these things that you may not have seen, so anyway, it's been very interesting, our research as well.
It reminds me of, I recently read a book called High Conflict by Amanda Ripley, and it's really, it's a fascinating look at how much we as a species kind of overemphasize our difference, where most human beings agree on most things. So something like 75 to 85% of things that we fundamentally agree on, but because back to kind of the start of humanity, we are focused on where the difference is because that causes conflict and can cause harm. We tend to lead with that versus leading with the things that are similar. And the research that you're both sharing really speaks to that. But I'd be curious, I would imagine that most donors, most volunteers don't go into situations and say things like that. I'm going to impose my values on the folks that I meet here, or I'm going to take a vacation and not care about the unintended consequences of my reactions. And that there's not necessarily an acknowledgement or recognition of that disconnect. So how do you get folks to check in with themselves and really clarify what their intentions are and close that perception gap between what's actually happening and what they think is happening?
I don't know if I have a complete answer to that, but I'll say some of it is we also do training, right? We don't presume, so we do the screening as I shared, but the reality is that people's perception of where they are is not always where they are, right? So we do have we call it a JEDI training, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so we do some training that's part of our core training, but then we have additional training along the way. We'll have special speakers come in to talk about the Native experience and what some of the fears or challenges or opportunities might be in supporting members of that community. We share a lot of and then we have a lot of resources for people to tap into. So we try to make sure that people are constantly getting a little bit of a baseline so their minds and their experience can open beyond whatever their experience is. And then again, if we we're lucky that we kind of have this opportunity of always oversight. So if people, we do a lot of coaching with folks when maybe their self-perception, right, and their actual behaviors don't totally match up.
And this is a great opportunity for donors. And so we saw from the polling at the beginning, we've got lots of Giving Circle members on the call today. We've got good data that says that donors don't generally understand volunteer programs from two important perspectives: how much they cost and how much impact and benefit they provide. They tend to underestimate the benefit and underestimate the and underestimate the costs of those programs. What Dena just described is a very high quality program with a professional volunteer coordinator who's educated in the norms of that community, who's a teacher and can impart those norms on the people that are volunteering, can create the structures for success. That is all too rare in our space, and it's rare because lots of nonprofits are forced to pay for those programs themselves. And so to be in the lookout as givers, as philanthropists, as funders, for the things that might not necessarily be asked for by nonprofits, but many volunteer-driven nonprofits greatly need, which is support for that kind of professionalization.
Well, and I think one of the themes that I've heard in nearly all of the different components of our conversation has been that we've got to resource and equip volunteers and donors, right? Creating some of the space for real honesty around the engagement. Jude, as you were talking about, really sharing the context and the history and the model. And then Dena and Alonda, as you were talking about, actually paying for training and therapy and onboarding. We have to invest in that upfront equipping of the folks that are engaging with our communities, and a recognition that the folks that are engaging with our communities are in our communities, right? That these are not separate entities. And I think a lot of the way that we talk about it often can create a chasm that's not actually there in reality. We are close to time, which is, that went by really quickly. This is a really big conversation. It feels like really just the start. And thank you again to the folks that have joined us today for such an active conversation and set of questions. I would love to just wrap up with, give us kind of one takeaway or one thing that you want to keep in folks' minds as they head back to their giving circles and they're thinking about this conversation as a tangible way to shape their own giving and service. And Dena, maybe I'll start with you and we can go around.
I'm going to kind of go off of what Jude just said. When you're thinking about your giving, when you are giving to support high quality volunteering programs, you're having a ripple effect because you're both supporting the ability of that organization, the volunteers' ability to support the purpose of that organization, and whatever skills and value that they're bringing back to their families and communities. And I don't think we can underestimate that.
And I would just add, exactly similar to Jude's comment about infrastructure and making sure that as donors, you're thinking about the things that the organization may not ask for, but they absolutely need: the capacity building, the training. We were able to get a donor to support our training needs. It wasn't something that we would have had in our budget, but it's so important now that I have included it moving forward. But I would just say to really be supportive of those infrastructure needs, especially things that support the volunteers, because, you know, what's the saying? Whether it's your staff or your volunteers, you feed your staff or they'll eat your customers. So I think about it in the same way. Make sure that you're taking care of your volunteers so they can take care of your, of your community.
And I would just say it's if you're thinking about giving to an organization, what better way to begin than by giving your time? And rather than asking an organization for its impact report, impact's expensive to measure and hard for organizations to get a beat on, go experience that impact yourself and do it over some period of time. Like it costs some money to get you up to speed in order to volunteer for that community. So spend some time, come back. See that program develop over the course of time so you can get a sense in a tangible way, in a way that you can relate to your friends and family about the contributions that nonprofit's having in your community.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're at time. Thank you again to all of our panelists. And Melissa, I will pass it back to you to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Yeah, thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Dena. Thank you, Jude. Thank you, Alonda. This was such a rich conversation. I wish we had more time. I'm personally very much in awe about the way that you all are leading. I just want to thank you again for sharing all of your wisdoms and learning today in this session. Before we wrap up, please take a minute to fill out the 2-question poll, which will be launching shortly. You'll be able to find a recording of this session on Whova within a few days. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our raffle winner for today, which is Rima Vora. Rima, when you get a chance, let us know what book you'd like, and congratulations. Thank you all so much again. For our next session, it's going to be Engage in the Mutual Aid Movement at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific time. Be sure to switch on Whova itself and it'll get you to the right Zoom. And thank you so much again. See you soon.